Hey guys, it's Josephine Olivia Gross here. Today I'll be reading Augusta Savage, Josephine Baker, Mahalia Jackson, and Rosa Parks from Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. Augusta Savage, educator, sculptor. Augusta grew up in a poor family with 13 brothers and sisters in Green Cove Springs, Florida. As a child, she had no toys to play with, but she loved making things. Augusta spent time in her back garden, where the soil was rich with natural red clay. This was where she learned to make miniature animals. However, her father did not approve of her creativity. Even though it meant angering him, Augusta continued to sculpt. In 1921, she moved to Harlem, a prominent African-American neighborhood in New York City. At the time, the community was experiencing an exciting boom in the arts known as the Harlem Renaissance, and Augusta was a part of it. She thrived artistically, but this did not change the hardships brought about by the racism that was still common in the United States and around the world. Augusta openly fought racial prejudice in the art world and was labeled a troublemaker. She said that she was standing up not only for herself, but for future students of color. Augusta dedicated much of her life to teaching and encouraging young people to pursue their artistic passion. She felt that their creations could be part of her legacy. In Harlem, she opened her own school, the Savage School of Arts and Crafts, and she became the first director of the Harlem Community Arts Center. In 1939, she created her most iconic work, a large piece commissioned by the New York World's Fair entitled Lift Every Voice and Sing, also known as the harp. Despite her artistic success, Augusta struggled with finances and racism until late in life, but she always found a way to keep creating art. Josephine Baker, singer, dancer. Josephine had an early start in the entertainment business. As a child in St. Louis, Missouri, she put on song and dance shows with the neighborhood children. By the time she was 14, she was working as a stagehand at local theaters. The first time she performed on stage, she made waves with her wild dancing and silliness. She stood out from the chorus line, and the other performers surely called her a scene stealer, but that was just Josephine's style. Josephine's career really took off when she went to Europe. France became her adoptive country, and Paris her stage. When she returned to the United States, American audiences were not very receptive to a black woman who seemed too uppity for her own skin. Josephine, meanwhile, was shocked by the prejudice and discrimination she encountered. From then on, she insisted on performance contracts that did not allow any form of discrimination and fought for integrated audiences. Her fearlessness did not end there. During the Second World War, Josephine worked for the French resistance, smuggling secret messages in her sheet music and undergarments. After the war, she was awarded two of France's highest military honors. Josephine built a large, loving family with adopted children from all over the world. She called them the Rainbow Tribe. In 1963, she traveled back to the United States to accompany Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. She was the only woman slated to speak that day. Josephine was never one to fall in line. She always stood out and made her own way. She was a brave woman who was so much more than just a performer. Mahalia Jackson, gospel singer. Born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana, Mahalia was always surrounded by the sounds of the blues and Mardi Gras. As a child, she sang jazz songs by Bessie Smith in her room at night. But little Haley, as she was called, came from a religious family, and the only music that was acceptable to them was gospel music. She made her singing debut in the choir at the Mount Maria Baptist Church and blew everyone away with her enormous voice. Later in life, she felt the urge to sing non-religious music, but she had made a promise to herself and her family to sing only gospel, and she stuck to it. She turned down big nightclub shows and lived on very little money. But in 1947, she recorded a single, Move On Up a Little Higher, that sold over 2 million copies. She gained a following around the United States and traveled for performances. Her shows drew large crowds from both the black and white communities. Segregation, however, was still the law of the land, and Mahalia struggled with it during and after her performances. When she was on the road, she kept food in her car, just so she wouldn't have to use the colored section of a restaurant. At the request of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Mahalia participated in the Montgomery bus boycott, and in 1963, she performed at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Reverend King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. She was on the podium behind him, and when he started to go off script, she encouraged him. "Tell him, Martin," she shouted. "Tell him about the dream." That most famous part of his speech wasn't planned, but Mahalia knew how powerful his words were and how important it would be to share them. Rosa Parks, activist, writer. Growing up in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa detested the rules of segregation, having to drink from different water fountains or being barred from whites-only restaurants. In the American South, rules on buses were particularly harsh. A black person had to enter through the front door, pay the fare, leave the bus, and then get on again through a rear door. Each bus had 3 sections, a whites-only section at the front, a black section at the back, and an overflow section in the middle. If the middle was empty, a black person could sit there. But if one white person wanted to sit in the middle, every black person would have to get up and stand in the back of the bus. In December 1955, after a long shift at work, Rosa waited for a bus with empty seats and finally got one with a seat in the overflow section. But when the white section became full, Rosa and others were asked to move. Enough was enough for Rosa. She refused to relinquish her seat. Rosa was arrested and jailed. She used her one phone call to contact her friends at the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Rosa was not the first person to fight these laws, and it wasn't even her first time. She had been arrested previously for defying bus rules, but her protest caught the attention of the whole country. Martin Luther King Jr. called for a boycott of all public transport in Montgomery. The Montgomery bus boycott was a key event of the civil rights movement and set off a chain reaction of protests across the United States. The boycott was ultimately successful. In 1956, the bus system became integrated. But there was still a long way to go in the fight for civil rights, so Rosa continued to work with the NAACP and the Black Power movement throughout her life, and was recognized as the mother of the modern-day civil rights movement. Thank you for listening, and next Tuesday I'll be reading Gwendolyn Brooks, Ella Fitzgerald, Mamie Phipps Clark, and Katherine Johnson from Little Leaders, Bold Women in Black History by Vashti Harrison. Have a great day and see you next week.